The first thing Ambassador Director Counselor Vane of the Thuresi Dominion did when he entered the chamber was laugh. It was not a malicious laugh, not the laugh of a being who wanted to cause offense or establish dominance through deliberate cruelty. It was the laugh of a being who had walked into a situation that was genuinely, objectively, undeniably funny, the kind of laugh that escapes before manners can catch it, the kind that you regret immediately but cannot take back because the universe has already heard it and filed it away for future reference. What had caused the laugh was the human delegation's display table. Every major civilization represented at the Galactic Council's Bicentennial Technology Summit had brought something to show. The Thuresi had brought a miniaturized singularity stabilizer, a device the size of a small suitcase that could generate and maintain a contained gravitational anomaly for up to 72 hours. The Voreth Collective had brought a biological computing matrix grown from engineered neural tissue that processed information at speeds that made conventional quantum computing look like an abacus. The Chelari had brought a prototype of their new generation stealth system, a field generator that bent light, energy, and probability around a vessel so completely that it became, for all meaningful purposes, not just invisible but undetectable by any known sensor technology. The humans had brought a gun. It sat on their display table in a case lined with gray foam, a long, dark, unpretentious object that looked, to every non-human eye in the chamber, like a crude projectile weapon of the sort that emerging civilizations tended to abandon approximately 30 seconds after they discovered directed energy. Vane had looked at it. He had looked at the human delegation, 3 people in neat dark uniforms standing beside their foam-lined case with expressions of quiet, composed dignity. He had looked back at the gun, and he had laughed. He was not alone. The Chelari representative had covered the lower portion of her face with her secondary hands, which was what Chelari did when they were trying not to laugh and failing. The Voreth Collective Mind's single designated speaker had made a sound that their translator rendered as amusement, which was the most diplomatic thing in the room. 14 other species had found various ways to register their appreciation of the joke. The humans had stood there and watched all of it with those expressions of quiet, composed dignity, and had said nothing. Ambassador Kezia Morrow, lead of the human delegation, had simply folded her hands in front of her and waited for the laughter to finish. She was 48 years old. She had a background in both physics and military history, which was an unusual combination for a diplomat, and she had been chosen for this specific assignment by people who understood exactly what kind of assignment it was. She waited. The laughter faded. The summit proceeded, and the gun sat in its foam-lined case on the human display table, undemonstrated, unexplained, and entirely unimpressive, for the first 3 days of a 5-day event. The Technology Summit was held every 200 years in a rotating location, and this cycle's host was the Marathi Convergence, a civilization of 8 billion spread across 12 star systems who had the particular combination of organizational capability and aggressive hospitality that made them natural event planners on a galactic scale. The venue was a station called the Pinnacle, custom-built for the summit and designed to accommodate the atmospheric, gravitational, and aesthetic requirements of 23 different species simultaneously. It was, by any reasonable standard, an extraordinary achievement of engineering and diplomacy. The humans had submitted their environmental requirements along with everyone else and had been assigned a section of the station calibrated to Earth standard, which meant standard gravity, nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, and ambient temperature in the range that humans found comfortable. Their quarters were pleasant. Their food was synthesized from their own nutritional profiles. Everything was very correct and very courteous, and Kezia Morrow had noticed, with the attention to detail that made her good at her job, that their section of the station was also very isolated. Their display table was in the main hall, because all delegations had display tables in the main hall, but the foot traffic past the human table was noticeably less than the foot traffic past any other table, and the invitations to side conversations and informal dinners that were the real currency of events like this had been, for the human delegation, sparse. They were new. They were the only species at the summit that was not a full conclave member, admitted on a provisional basis under the terms of the post-Colin War Accords that had given humanity formal recognition without formal membership. They were tolerated. They were not yet taken seriously. Kezia Morrow understood all of this. She had been briefed on all of this. She had come to this summit with a very clear objective that had nothing to do with winning friends or influencing policy or demonstrating humanity's readiness for full conclave membership, though those things were desirable and she would pursue them if the opportunity arose. Her objective was simpler and more specific. She had come here to demonstrate one thing, to one particular audience, in one particular way, at one particular moment. Everything else was preparation for that moment. The moment she was waiting for was determined by the summit's agenda, which she had memorized in its entirety on the flight over. On day 4, the summit's technology demonstration session was scheduled. Each delegation would demonstrate their submission in sequence. The humans were last on the list, which was a protocol decision based on their status as the most recently admitted delegation. Last meant that by the time it was their turn, every other civilization's technology would have already been shown. Every jaw that could drop would have already dropped. Every superlative would have already been applied to something else. The audience would be full and slightly sated, the way audiences always were by the end of a long demonstration day, and the humans, with their gun in a foam-lined case, would have the least compelling finale in the summit's recorded history. That was what the schedule said. Kezia Morrow had read the schedule and thought about it for a long time. Then she had called her team together and told them what she needed from each of them over the next 4 days, and they had gone to work. Day 1 of the summit was introductions, diplomatic pleasantries, and the opening ceremony, which was spectacular in the particular way that Marathi events tended to be spectacular. With light displays and synchronized sound, and a formal address by the conclave's current presiding elder that touched on themes of cooperation, shared progress, and the importance of each civilization contributing its unique perspective to the collective advancement of all. It was a good speech. Kezia Morrow listened to it carefully and noted, with the part of her mind that was always working, that the presiding elder made no specific reference to humanity's presence at the summit, which was either an oversight or a statement, and in her experience, there were very few oversights at events organized at this level. Day 2 was the formal exhibition period, when delegations could examine each other's display submissions at their leisure. This was when Vane had laughed. This was when the Chelari representative had covered her face. This was when Kezia Morrow had stood very still beside her foam-lined case and waited, and the rest of her team had moved through the exhibition hall with the quiet, purposeful efficiency of people who had a job to do and were doing it. Her team's job on day 2 was to look at everything, not the display pieces, though they looked at those too. They looked at the Thuresi delegation's body language when they discussed their singularity stabilizer with the Vorath. They looked at which species clustered together and which avoided each other. They looked at the seating arrangements during the exhibition day lunch and noted who sat next to whom, and who chose seats that minimized proximity to whom. They looked at the faces of the Marathi hosts when they thought no one was watching, which was the most informative thing you could look at in any political environment, because hosts at their own events had the particular quality of caring deeply about how everything was going while trying to appear to care only moderately, and the gap between those two things was readable if you knew what to look for. By the end of day 2, Kezia Morrow's political analyst, a young man named Dr. Finn Oduya who had a doctorate in xenosociology and the best instincts for reading a room of anyone she had ever worked with, had compiled a precise map of the summit's actual social and political topology, which differed from its official agenda in a number of interesting ways. The most interesting way was this. The presiding elder's speech had been about cooperation and shared progress, But the real conversation happening at this summit, in the side meetings and the dinner tables and the quiet corridor exchanges, was about a specific piece of Voreth technology that had not been on the display table. It had been described, obliquely, in a paper submitted to the summit's Technical Review Committee 3 months prior, and it was the reason that 11 of the 23 delegations had made attendance at this particular summit a priority, rather than sending junior representatives as they sometimes did. The Voreth Collective had developed, or claimed to have developed, a new class of faster-than-light drive that was theoretically capable of reducing transit times across the full diameter of the Milky Way from the current best of approximately 6 months to approximately 11 days. If true, it was the single most significant technological development in 300 years. It would redraw every map of strategic and economic importance in the galaxy. It would make some civilizations vastly more powerful and some vastly less. Everyone at this summit understood this. No one at this summit was talking about it openly, because talking about it openly would require acknowledging the political implications, which everyone had extremely strong opinions about, and no one was ready to negotiate in public yet. Kezia Morrow looked at Dr. Oduya's report and sat with it for a long time. Then she made a decision that she had not been authorized to make, that she had in fact been specifically instructed not to make without direct approval from Earth's government, and that she made anyway because she understood something about this moment that the people who had written her instructions could not, because they were not in this room, watching these faces, reading this room. She sent an encrypted message to Earth. It said, "I need authorization for full disclosure." The response came back in 4 hours. It said, "Explain." She explained. The response came back in 2 hours. It said, "Authorized. Proceed at your discretion." She put her communicator away and went to find Counselor Vane of the Theresi Dominion, who had laughed at her on day 2 and who was, according to Dr. Oduya's analysis, the single most important political figure in the room for what she was about to do. She found him at the reception that evening, standing with a group of Theresi delegates near the observation window that looked out onto the star field beyond the Pinnacle Station. He saw her coming, and she watched him decide, in real time, how to handle the approach, a slight recalibration of his posture, a smoothing of his expression from private amusement to public courtesy. She appreciated the professionalism of it. She stopped in front of him and said, with no preamble, that she would like to speak with him privately tomorrow morning, before the demonstration sessions began, and that she had something to show him that was not on the display table. Vane looked at her for a moment. Whatever he had expected her to say, it was not that. He said he was available at the 7th hour of the station's morning cycle. She thanked him and walked away. She found 9 other people that evening and said variations of the same thing to each of them. She went to bed at what the station's chronometer marked as midnight and slept for 5 hours, which was all she needed. Day 4 began at the 7th hour with 10 private meetings conducted in the human delegation's quarters, one after another, each lasting between 20 and 40 minutes. Each meeting involved Kezia Morrow, one member of her team, and the relevant guest. Each meeting was different in its specifics but identical in its structure. She showed them something. She explained what it was. She answered their questions. Then she said, quietly and without drama, that they were welcome to be anywhere in the hall they chose during the human demonstration that afternoon, and that she hoped they would find it informative. Counselor Vane was her first meeting. He arrived at the 7th hour precisely, which she had expected, because Theresi valued punctuality as a form of respect, and whatever Vane was, he was not disrespectful. He sat across from her at the small table in the meeting room, and she placed on the table between them a data tablet displaying a technical schematic. He looked at the schematic. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a tone that she noted contained no laughter, that he wanted to understand what he was looking at. She explained what he was looking at. When she was finished, he asked 4 questions. She answered all 4 completely and honestly. Then he asked the question she had been waiting for, the question that all 10 of her morning guests were going to ask in one form or another, the question that the schematic made inevitable. He asked if it worked. She said yes. He asked how she knew. She said because they had tested it. He asked what the test results were. She placed a second tablet on the table. He read it. He was quiet for a very long time. When he looked up at her, she saw something in his expression that she had not seen from a non-human face since she had arrived at this summit. She saw attention, real attention, the kind that meant he had recalibrated everything and was now looking at her as what she was rather than what he had assumed she was. She thanked him for his time and showed him to the door. The technology demonstration sessions began at the 14th hour. The Marathi hosts had arranged the hall beautifully, curved tiers of seating facing a central demonstration platform, the lighting warm and flattering, the translation systems flawless. The first demonstration was the Thoressi Singularity Stabilizer, and it was, as advertised, extraordinary. The device generated a contained gravitational field that the presenter walked a small probe through with perfect stability, and the murmur of appreciation from the assembled delegates was genuine. The Cellari stealth system was, if anything, even more impressive. The presenter activated the field and the entire demonstration unit, a vessel the size of an atmospheric shuttle, simply ceased to exist for all practical purposes, its absence detectable only by the fact that you could see the space it should have occupied. The Voreth biological computing matrix solved 17 simultaneous equations of the sort that required months of conventional processing in approximately 4 seconds, which produced a silence in the hall that was more eloquent than applause. By the time the 14th demonstration had concluded, the hall had the quality that Kezia Morrow had anticipated, a settled, satisfied fullness, the comfortable weight of an audience that had seen remarkable things and was already beginning the process of ranking and comparing them. Then the Marathi host announced the human delegation. There was a murmur, low and not entirely kind, that moved through the hall. Kezia Morrow walked to the demonstration platform with her 2 team members who were carrying the foam-lined case between them. They set it on the demonstration platform. They opened it. They lifted out the gun. It looked exactly as unimpressive as it had looked on the display table. Long, dark, unpretentious, it was the kind of object that communicated nothing about itself to anyone who did not already know what it was. Kezia Morrow stood at the podium and looked out at 23 delegations, and however many observers and staff and recording systems the Galactic Council had arrayed around her. And she said, in the clear, unhurried voice of someone who was not nervous, that the device her colleagues were holding was a directed mass kinetic projector, operating on principles derived from a theoretical framework that humanity had developed independently over the past 40 years. She said that it fired a single type of projectile. She said that the projectile was not explosive, not energetic, not biological, not chemical. She said that the projector had a range, in vacuum, of approximately 0.3 light seconds, which was roughly 90,000 kilometers. She paused and let that number settle. It settled differently on different faces. The ones who understood what it meant had the particular stillness of beings recalculating something important. She then said that the demonstration target was located 0.3 light seconds from the Pinnacle Station, and that it was a decommissioned Marathi cargo hauler of approximately 40,000 tons that the summit's organizing committee had been kind enough to provide, and that if the assembled delegates would direct their attention to the external view screens, they would see the target displayed in real time. The view screens showed the cargo hauler, boxy and old and very large, sitting in space at exactly the distance she had described. She said that she would now fire the projector once. One of her team members raised the weapon, aimed it at a targeting sensor built into the demonstration platform that was linked to the external targeting system, and fired. There was no sound. There was no flash. There was no visible beam or bolt or indication of any kind that anything had happened. And then the view screen showed the 40,000-ton cargo hauler come apart, not explode, not vaporize, come apart as if something had passed through its center and the structural integrity that held it together had simply decided to stop working. It separated into 2 pieces, then 4. Then the pieces themselves began to fragment, not violently but methodically, the way a thing comes apart when the forces holding it together are overcome by the forces pulling it in different directions. And within 12 seconds of the shot there was, where the cargo hauler had been, an expanding cloud of debris that had formerly been 40,000 tons of metal and composite material, and was now a very large collection of smaller objects moving in slightly different directions. The hall was completely silent. Kezia Morrow waited. The silence continued. She said into the silence that the projector had fired a single round of 1.4 kilograms. She said that the round had no propellant, no explosive charge, no energy component of any kind. She said that what the round did was travel at a velocity that caused its mass to interact with the target material in a way that conventional physics described as a momentum transfer, but that her team's theoretical physicists preferred to describe, somewhat colorfully, as a very firm disagreement with the target's structural assumptions. She said that the effective yield, in conventional energy equivalence terms, was approximately 4.2 terajoules. She said this was derived from a 1.4 kilogram round. She said that the projector's magazine held 50 rounds. She said that the round's velocity was achieved through a drive mechanism that operated on principles humanity was prepared to share with the full conclave technical committee, subject to appropriate treaty frameworks governing application and deployment. Then she said thank you, and she stepped back from the podium, and she folded her hands in front of her, and she waited. The silence in the hall lasted for a full 40 seconds, which was, in her experience of multilateral events, an extraordinarily long time for a large gathering of sentient beings to be completely quiet. Councillor Vane was the one who broke the silence. He did not applaud, though some of the other delegates had begun a species-appropriate version of it. He simply stood up and looked at Kezia Morrow from across the hall, and she looked back at him, and he said, in a voice that carried clearly through the translation systems, that he owed her an apology. She said that was not necessary. He said that it was, that he had been dismissive and he had been wrong, and in his experience the best way to handle being wrong was to say so clearly and then to do better. She said that she appreciated that. He asked, with a directness that the Thuresi were culturally known for, what humanity wanted from this moment. She said she would prefer to discuss that in the context of the formal negotiations that she hoped the conclave would be prepared to enter into following the conclusion of the summit, and that her government had authorized her to open those discussions at whatever level the conclave deemed appropriate. He said he would speak to the presiding elder. She said she would be grateful. He sat down. She remained at the podium. The presiding elder, a Voreth of considerable age whose name rendered in human phonetics as something approximating Council Master Oratine, had been watching this exchange with an expression that Kezia Morrow could not fully read, but that Dr. Oduya, watching from the delegation seating, later described as looking exactly like someone who has just been reminded of something they should not have forgotten. Oratine stood and said, in the formal register that conclave elders used for significant pronouncements, that the Galactic Council recognized the significance of the technology presented by the human delegation, and that the Council's Technical Review Committee would be in contact with the human delegation regarding the appropriate framework for further examination. He said this in the way that bureaucratic bodies say things that mean more than their literal content, and everyone in the hall understood that what he was saying was that humanity had just permanently changed its position in the galaxy's political landscape, and that the Council acknowledged this, and that the Council was prepared to respond accordingly. Kezia Morrow bowed her head slightly in the formal human gesture of respect that she had practiced for this moment. Then she walked back to her team, who closed the foam-lined case and carried it off the platform, and the human delegation returned to their seats. The negotiations that followed the summit lasted 14 months. They were difficult, detailed, contentious in places, and produced a treaty framework that was later called the Pinnacle Accords, a name taken from the station where the whole thing had started. The Pinnacle Accords established humanity as a provisional full member of the Galactic Conclave, with voting rights on matters directly affecting human territorial interests, and observer status on all other matters, with a review period of 25 years at the end of which full membership with unrestricted voting rights would be considered. They established a technology-sharing framework that was careful and specific, and designed to ensure that the principles behind the directed mass kinetic projector, which the Conclave's technical committee had taken exactly 3 weeks to confirm as genuine and working and theoretically revolutionary, were developed cooperatively and with appropriate safeguards rather than in an uncontrolled proliferation that could destabilize the existing balance of power. They established formal diplomatic relations between humanity and every conclave member species, replacing the provisional post-Colin War framework with something permanent and reciprocal. And they established, in the treaty's preamble, a principle that Amara Osai, who had retired but followed the negotiations closely, and whose opinion Kezia Morrow had sought 3 times during the most difficult moments, said was the most important thing the whole document contained. The principle stated that the Galactic Conclave recognized the right of every sentient species to develop its capabilities to their fullest extent, and recognized further that the failure to engage with a civilization as a peer was not neutral, but was an active choice with consequences, and that the Council committed to apply that principle going forward in its engagement with all emerging civilizations. It was, in diplomatic terms, an admission. A quiet, carefully worded, legally binding admission that the old way of doing things had costs, and that those costs had names and faces, and they lived in a colony on Kepler 442b, and on a station called the Pinnacle, and in every moment where a delegation from a species the galaxy had underestimated had stood quietly beside a foam-lined case and waited for the laughter to stop. Councillor Vane signed the Pinnacle Accords on behalf of the Thoressi Dominion. He signed it second, after the presiding elder, which was a protocol gesture indicating strong support. Before he signed, he looked across the table at Kezia Morrow and asked one more question. He asked why they had chosen to demonstrate it the way they had, the quiet display for 2 days, the private meetings in the morning, the demonstration at the end. She thought about how to answer that. She said that her people had a saying, that you never got a second chance to make a first impression, and that the first impression had already been made incorrectly, which meant what she had needed to do was not make a first impression but correct a wrong one. She said that the difference between those 2 things was everything. She said that if she had walked in and led with the technology, the response would have been skepticism, because the Conclave's picture of humanity did not have a frame for it yet. She needed to build the frame first. She needed them to have already laughed, and she needed them to know that she had watched them laugh and waited and said nothing before the demonstration. Because then when the cargo hauler came apart, what they felt was not just surprise. What they felt was the particular, destabilizing shame of realizing that the thing they had dismissed had been entirely aware of being dismissed, and had been patient about it, and had been right to be patient. And that feeling was worth more, strategically, than any amount of firepower. Vane looked at her for a long moment. Then he signed the document. He never laughed at anything human again, not because he was afraid, because he had learned that whenever something human seemed unimpressive, the most important question was not what it appeared to be. The most important question was what it was waiting for. The gun sat in its foam-lined case in a secure facility on Earth for the next 30 years, until the technical sharing framework produced a successor technology that made it obsolete. Then it was donated to the Galactic Conclave's Historical Museum, where it was displayed with a placard that told the story of the Pinnacle Summit in 7 sentences. The placard was accurate. It contained all the facts. It left out only one thing, which was the 40 seconds of silence in the hall after the cargo hauler came apart, and the specific texture of that silence, which was not the silence of shock, though it contained shock. It was the silence of 23 civilizations simultaneously revising a belief they had not known they held until the moment they were required to revise it. The belief was this: that the galaxy's story was already written, that the places of honor in it were already assigned, that the newcomers from the blue planet were a footnote at most, a peripheral detail in a history that had been unfolding for 6,000 years without them. The 40-second silence was the sound of 23 civilizations discovering that they had been wrong. And it was, by any measure, the most eloquent thing said in that hall all week.